We begin today a new Perek, the third Perek of Masechta Zevochim. Daf Lamed Aleph from its base towards the bottom of the Yomud. This Mishnah will continue halachas regarding the carbon. Dr. Eilige Mishnah call hapasulim sheshachtu. All different kinds of individuals that are not fit to do the Aved in the Beis HaMikdash, which were listed in the beginning of the previous Perek. So if they shech the carbon, shchitas and ksheira, the slaughtering of the carbon is good. Why? Shashchite ksheira bezarim, because shechting the carbon could be done even by a non-kayin, ubenashim, with women, ba'avadim, by an eved, this is an eved kanani, ubetmeim, and even someone that's impure, he could also shecht, which the Gemara will discuss, because Rashi here says that when it says here Tameim, it's talking about a Tamei Sheretz, someone that got Tamei from something that's Sheretz, a creeping, crawling thing that makes him Tamei. And then the knife that he holds will not become Tamei, and therefore he won't make the actual animal, the meat of the animal, Tamei. We don't want him to make it Tamei. That's one option, Rashi says. Or it could be even speaking about a Tamei mace, a person that is Tamei from a dead body, but he's holding a knife which is not made from metal. A knife that's made from a sharp reed, which is not makabel tumeh. It's just like, it's what's called pshute kliyetz. It's just a piece of wood that will not make the behemoth tumeh. So he could shecht as long as he does it in a way that he won't make the carbon tumeh. Now, this halacha that all psulim could shecht, the carbon includes any kind of carbon, including kachim kachim, the higher level of kedusha of kachim. Regarding the tameh, as long as he's careful not to touch the meat of the carbon.
How is he going to shecht it if he doesn't touch the meat?
Well, he's using a knife, and that's not going to be makabel tumah, right. And he makes sure that he himself does not touch the meat.
So he doesn't hold the animal. He's not holding the animal.
Correct. Only the knife. The knife. Just with the knife. Now, lefichach. So since regarding shchite, all psulim are kosher to shech, so heim paislim b'machshava. All the halachas we learned to learn in the Masechta. If you have a machshava that passes the carbon, will apply even to these people. When it comes to any other aveda that must be done through a kayin, someone that's puzzled that shechts and has an aveda or that does any of the avedas and he's puzzled, his machshava does not affect the carbon. Okay. But since this is kosher with all these people to shecht, so therefore their machshava will affect the carbon. Any of these the people that are apostle, shekiblu es adam chutz lizmane. Going on to the next aveda, after shechting, they receive the blood with a machshava that then the carbon will be eaten or will be brought in the mizbeach out of its right time, or v'chutz l'mekaymai out of its right place, which passes the carbon. Im yesh dam hanefesh, if there's still dam from the animal, which is called dam hanefesh, so this is what we learned about before here, that it has to be blood, that the dam shah nefesh yaitzavai, not blood that comes right at the beginning of the shechita, not dam that's there all the way later on after the dam hanefesh comes out. It has to be dam, if there's more dam hanefesh that's used to spray in the mizbeach, so then yachzer akosher v'yekabel. The kain that's kosher can go back and receive this blood and do the aveda. Okay, which means that this person that's pasul and he had a machshava to pasul the carbon, when he received his blood, it doesn't affect the status of the carbon. Rashi here brings, by the pasuk where it speaks about the machshava that passes the carbon, it says the kain hamakriv, that the kain that brings the carbon, his machshava affects the carbon. But if it's someone that's pasul and has this kind of machshava, it doesn't affect the carbon, so it can be redone. Kibala kosher, if the kain that's kosher receives the blood, v'nasal pasul, and he gave this the blood over to someone that's pasul, yachzel kosher, let him give it back to the kain that's kosher to bring it to the mizbeach. This was quoted earlier in the Masechta, as Rashi brings here, that there were two pshatim about this. There's the one that's pasul have to give it back to the kain that's kosher, in the position that the kain was kosher was standing in the beginning, or could the kain that's kosher come around to the other side and take it from him, from the side of the pasul that's closer to the mizbeach. Those were the two pshatim. Another case, kibul b'minoi, if the kain received the blood the way the aveda is always supposed to be done in the right hand, as we learned earlier in the previous Perek. But then the nasan l'smaila puts it into his left hand, yachzel yaminei puts it back into his right hand and continues the aveda. Kibble b'kli kodesh. The kohen received the blood in a proper keli, in a holy vessel. V'nosan l'kli chayil, and then he put it into a mundane vessel. Yachzer l'kli kodesh. He puts the blood back into a kli kodesh and does the aveda. Nishpach min hakeli ala ritzpa. The blood from the carbon was received in the vessel, and then from the vessel it was spilled onto the floor. V'asafa, and he gathers the blood. Kosher. This blood is kosher to be used. This is in contrast to a mishnah that we learned before, that if the blood went from the throat of the animal directly on the floor, then he can't gather it into a vessel to spray in the mizbeach. Now, nosnoi al gabe yakevesh. If the blood was sprayed onto the wrong place on the mizbeach, on the ramp of the mizbeach, it's supposed to be sprayed on the mizbeach itself. Or shaloi keneged yisoid, an area of the mizbeach where you don't have a foundation of the mizbeach. The foundation of the mizbeach was on Maravis, on Draimis, the south, on the west, but not on the other corner. So he's supposed to spray the blood on the mizbeach where you could see the foundation of the mizbeach. So he sprayed it in the wrong place. Or nasan esanitana lamato lamailo. The blood that's supposed to be sprayed on the bottom half of the mizbeach was sprayed above, or the opposite. The one that's supposed to be sprayed above was sprayed on the bottom. Or even a bigger mistake, blood that's supposed to be brought inside the Beis Hamikdash and the inner mizbeach, bachutz, was sprayed on the outer mizbeach. Or from the outer mizbeach, instead it was sprayed on the inner mizbeach. So in all these cases, Im yesh dam nefesh, if you still have blood from the animal, dam nefesh, yachzer, hakosher v'yekabel. The kohen that's kosher can receive it again and spray the blood. So regarding this part of the Mishnah, Rashi here brings, we learned it earlier in the previous Perek, there were also two pshatim here. Is this talking about when the first time around, the blood that was sprayed in the wrong place, even a kohen kosher did this the first time, and it's saying, but because it was sprayed in the wrong place in the mizbeach, so it didn't take effect. So now it has to be done over again by a kohen kosher. That's one pshat. But there's another pshat that if it was a kohen kosher that did this, then even if it was placed on the wrong place in the mizbeach, Shmuel says in the previous Perek, blood that's placed anywhere on the mizbeach, even if it's in the wrong place, it's accepted for the carbon itself. And therefore, when it says here, Nosna al Gabi Kevesh, it's continuing from the beginning of the Mishnah where it speaks about a kohen that was puzzled, or anyone that was puzzled that did the Aveda the first time around, and therefore has to be done again by a kohen that's kosher. Okay, so the Gemara now starts with the first part of the Mishnah regarding Shechita. So the Gemara, the Mishnah said, Shachtoi, so it's mashma, when it says that any of those that are puzzled that shechted, it'll be accepted. So this term is mashma, the yevedin, that b'diavad, after the fact, it's okay. But in the beginning, you should not allow someone that's puzzled to shech the carbon. In fact, Gemara v'ramino, but I'll ask you from what it says in the Braisa. The pasuk says v'shochat, that you shech the carbon, shchita b'zog ksheira. Shchita is kosher even by a non-kohen. Shashchita ksheira b'zarim, or b'noshim, b'avodim, or b'tmeim, as the Mishnah listed, and v'afilu b'kotche. The Braisa goes on to say, Oy einoi ela b'koyanim. Maybe I would say that shchita, like all the other avodas, must be done by a kohen. So Amrit, you'll say as follows: what would be your source to say this? Because the pasuk says regarding all the avodas, va'ata ubanecha itcha tishmaru es kohunaschem. L'chol dvar mizbeach, that it's used Aaron HaKohen and his children, that they have to keep everything that's done for the mizbeach. It says l'chol dvar mizbeach, everything. So that would include shchita as well. So yochel av b'shchita, I would think it includes slaughtering the animal. Talmud Laimar. So then there's another pasuk though, right in the beginning of Chumash Vayikra, where it says b'shachat as ben habakar lefnei Hashem, and then afterwards it says after you shecht it, v'krivoi v'gaimer. The continuation of the pasuk is v'krivoi b'nei Aaron, v'krivu, that is b'nei Aaron HaKoyanim. So what does that mean? V'krivu is receiving the blood, and only there does it say b'nei Aaron HaKoyanim. V'kabala v'eilech mitzvahs kahuna. Only from receiving the blood is where there's the mitzvah that it should be done through a kohen. So limed ala shchita shaksheira b'chol adam. So that means that the shchita itself is kosher to be done by anybody. So the question of the Gemara is, in this Braisa, you see clearly that it's saying that the shchita is l'chatchila, kosher to be done by anybody, not only after the fact, not only b'diavad, like it's mashma from the Mishnah. So the Gemara answers, Hu adeh and dafil l'chatchila nami. You're right. As we see here in this Braise, even l'chatchila, it can be done by anybody. So why does the Mishnah use the term of shachtu, a lashon b'di'evet? Because the reason is, Mushum de Kabbalah misni tmeim. Because one of the things that are listed here is the tmeim that could be shechting. The l'chatchila regarding tmeim, l'chatchila he should not be shechting. Gzeira shema yigu bebasar, because there's a gzeira midrabana that he may come to touch the meat. As the Mishnah says, he has to be careful not to touch the basar of the carbon. So therefore, since regarding the tmeim, it has to say b'di'evet. So therefore, tana sheshachtu. So it uses the term shachtu b'di'evet regarding the psulim that the Mishnah lists. Now, the Gemara asks on this itself: Tomei di'evet shaper dami, a tomei b'di'evet, if he shechted, will it be accepted? But Aminu, well, I'll ask you from what it says in another Braise, v'samach v'shachat. In the pasuk, it says together. It says first v'samach. And in the next pasuk, it says right away, after you do the smicha, you lean with your hands on the animal, on the head of the animal, that says yishech. So we compare the two. Ma smicha b'tahirim, just like the smicha has to be done only by someone that's pure, as the Gemara is soon going to bring the source. Av shchita b'tahirim, so too shechting has to be by someone that's pure. So you see here clearly that it must be by someone that's pure, and even b'di'evet, it sounds like it would not be accepted if it was done, the shchita was done by someone that's tamei. Answers the Gemara, no, it's all only midrabanan. That really, even this Braise that says that the shechita should be done by someone that's pure, it's only, as we mentioned, the gzeira midrabanan, since he may come to touch the basar. The Braise brings this pasuk, this hekish, seemingly, it's not a real hekish, and it's an asmachta, it's not, but really the concept of shechting that he should be taught is only a gzeira midrabanan. Okay, so now the Gemara explains this inyan. The Gemara, so Maishna, what's the difference between them? Maishna smicha, what's the source that the smicha of the carbon must be done by someone which is tired? The chsiv lefnei Hashem, the pasuk says that it has to be done lefnei Hashem. So what does lefnei Hashem mean? Lefnei Hashem means you're standing in the azara, only someone that's tired could stand inside the azara. So therefore we know that the smicha has to be done by someone that's tired. If so, shchita nami yaksel lefnei Hashem. So regarding the shchita, the pasuk also uses the term v'shachat es ben abakar lefnei Hashem. So why am I saying that the shchita does not have to be min hatayre by someone that's tired? Answers the Gemara, efsher the ovid saken arucha v'shachit. Regarding the shchita, the animal has to be lefnei Hashem, and then the kayin or whoever it is that's shechting could be standing outside the azara using a very long knife and shechting this way, even though he is not lefnei Hashem. So the Gemara asks, if that's the case, so then smicha nami efsher. So why don't you say similar regarding the shchit, the smicha that is? It's also possible. The ma'ayil yodei, let him stand outside of the azara, and only with his hands it'll be inside the azara, and the animal is inside, and he sticks his hands in and places his hands on the animal v'samich, and does the smicha that way. So he doesn't even have to enter into the azara to be lefnei Hashem. Answers the Gemara, no, because Kasavar, the Tan of this Braisa holds, Biyeh b'miktsas, shmo biyeh. If you enter partially, that qualifies as entering completely, and therefore you enter, you're inside, and you're not allowed to enter inside when you're tamei. This is one version of the pshat of this Braisa and the discussion about this. Rav Chizda Masni Yipcher, Rav Chizda learned this whole subject, they're all in the opposite. Then when it says in the pasuk v'samach, and then it says v'shachat, so I learn out and compare ma shchita b'tayrin, just like the shchita must be by someone that's pure, af smicha b'tayrin. We learn the smicha from the shchita, not the other way around. So now, according to this version, the question was asked, what's the difference? Regarding shchita, you say that minat Torah must be by someone that's pure lifnei Hashem. So smicha that is, smicha namik sev lifnei Hashem. Regarding the smicha, the Torah also uses the term lifnei Hashem. So why are you learning the smicha from the shchita? Answers the Gemara, the reason is because by the smicha, the lifnei Hashem doesn't prove that he has to be pure, because efshir the ma'ayil yadeh v'samich. He's able to just stick his hands in while he's standing outside and do the smicha that way, and that's okay. According to this Manda Omar, as long as he didn't enter completely, it's fine. If that's the case, if so, regarding shchita, he could have a long knife and shecht while he's standing outside. So why are we saying that he has to be lifnei Hashem? Answers the Gemara that Hamani, this Braisa here, according to this version, is Shimon Atimni. It's following the opinion of Shimon Atimni that says that the one that shechts himself has to be standing also Lufnei Hashem. The Tanya, we learned in the Braisa Machlokes about this. It says in the Pasuk, V'shochat has been a bakar Lufnei Hashem. So the Tanakam is Medayik. It says that the bakar, the animal, has to be Lufnei Hashem, but V'lo Yashaychid Lufnei Hashem. One that's shechting, he does not have to stand Lufnei Hashem, only the Ben Abakar. However, Shimon Atimni Yomer, Minayin she'iyu yodav shel sheichet lefnim min hanishchat. How do I know that the hands of the one that's shechting has to be inside, even more inside than the behemoth itself? So he also has to be Lufnei Hashem. Talmud Loima v'shachat as Ben Habakar Lufnei Hashem. So from this we learn out that just like the bakar has to be Lifnei Hashem, so the v'shachat, the one that's shechting, sheichet is ben ha-bakar yehei Lifnei Hashem. The one that's shechting should also be inside Lifnei Hashem. So therefore, this Braisa here that says that the sheichet has to be Lifnei Hashem is this opinion, Shimon Atimni's opinion. Okay, so now here the Gemara brings a discussion regarding this concept that was just brought up before, biyeh b'miktsas, when one enters partially. That according to Ula, when you enter partially, that's like you entered fully. So Amar Ula, Amar Reish Lakish, Ula says in the name of Reish Lakish, Tamei sheichnis yadai lifnim. A person that's Tamei, that sticks his hands inside. So he's only inside partially, but loike, he gets malchus for this. And the reason is, how do you know that a partial entry is like a full entry? Shanem, the Pasuk says, B'chol kodesh lo siga v'gaimet. The Pasuk concludes and says, V'ela mikdash lo savei. So we compare the two. Makish, biyeh l'negiah. I compare entering to touching, something which is tummy. Manegiyah b'miktzas shma negiyah. Just like when you touch something, even just touching partially, a little, so that's negiyah, that's touching. You become tummy. So to over here, av biyeh b'miktzas shma biyeh. When you entered partially, that's like you entered fully, and you'll be chayiv malchus for this. This is the source for this halacha that Ola said in the name of Reish Lakish. Okay, so now the Gemara asks on this from a Braisa. So Eisver Rav Hoshi Ula, Rav Hoshi asked Ula, the Braisa says, Mitzayre Shachal Shmini Shaloi Liyos Be'erev Pesach. A Mitzayre, that is a person that's Tamei. Mitzayre actually is supposed to be out of all the Machnas Yisrael completely, which means he can't even be in the city of Yerushalayim either. And then what happens with the Mitzayre? He has to purify himself, and he comes on the 7th day, he tavels in the mikveh, and then on the 8th day, he's going to have to bring his carbon. Until he doesn't bring a carbon on the 8th day, he's what's called mechusa kippurim. He's lacking that carbon, and he can't eat from any kachim. So now this Mitzayre, he's coming on the 8th day to bring his carbon. It's Erev Pesach, and he wants to bring his carbon so that he could be allowed to eat from the carbon Pesach that evening, so they could bring the carbon Pesach by day. But what happened though? Another thing happened there. He also has now another toma, a keri, seminal emission where he becomes tome, and the toval, and he was tovel on that day. So now this person that toveled on this day, he's not pure until at night either. Okay, similar to this mitzayre that he has to bring a carbon, and then only at night could he eat from the carbon. So this full yom, he toveled on that day, he has to wait until at night. And until at night, he's not allowed to enter into the Azara. It's Asr Menatayri for him to enter into the Azara. Now, Rashi explains that there's an Isser of entering into the Harabayis, but that is an Isser where there's no Chiyuv of Kodesh. When you enter into the Azara, which is Mamish, the place of the Beis HaMikdash, there's the Chiyuv of Kodesh. So now this person is both a Mitzayre and now a Tful Yom. So Amr Chachamim, the Chachamim say, Fal Pisha ain't Tful Yom Acher Nichnas, even though no other Tful Yom is allowed to enter into the Azara, and the Tana of this Braisa holds that this is a Isam and a Teire, but nevertheless, Ze Nichnas. This Tful Yom will be allowed to enter. Now, how does he enter? What would be the reason for him to have to enter? Because for the Mitzayre, in order for the Mitzayre to be purified, what has to be done is, he can't walk inside with his whole body, but he has to stick in his fingers in order for the kohen to place on his fingers from the blood of the carbon, and there's also from oil that has to be placed on his fingers and on different parts of his body in order for him to be purified, bayan yad, bayan regel, and so on. And now the blood of the carbon and the oil cannot be taken out of the azara, but he's a mitzayre and he can't walk inside either. So therefore, the halach is that he has to stick his fingers inside. Okay, but the problem is he's not only a Mitzayda. For the Mitzayda, he's allowed to stick his fingers inside. But he's also what full Yom. He was Tomei, and he has a Isam and Atayda with a Chi of Kodesh to stick his fingers inside. So, but the Braise here says he's able to stick his fingers inside. Why? Because Mutiv Yavai Ese Sheyesh Bei Kodesh. It's better that let an Ese, that there's a Kodesh to this, which is the carbon Pesach. If you don't bring the carbon Pesach, there's a Ese Kodesh, if it's bemazed. And so that chiyuv of the carbon Pesach v'yitche esse she'en by Kodesh. Let it push off an esse where there's no Kodesh. This is the Braisa that the Gemara is going to ask a question on what Ola said before. Ola said if you enter partially, that's like you entered fully, that means that there should be a chiyuv Kodesh and him sticking his fingers inside. Okay, but before the Gemara addresses the question from this Braisa, it brings another opinion, which is not really relevant for the question here, but it brings another opinion, Rabbi Yechanan, that argues with what it says in this Braisa. Rabbi Yechanan says, Dvar Teire, that this person that's at full yom, he tabled on that day, so really, min Teire, afila esse ein bay. There's no isser of an esse regarding this individual. He can enter into the harabayis without a problem. So the harabayis is, what's the status of a harabayis? All the way till into the Azara, there's the Ezras Noshim. That's also in the category of harabayis. He's allowed to enter there. Over there, there's no even isser esse at all. Shanema, there's a pasuk that says, "Vayamid Yehoshaphat Bekal Yehuda v'Yerushalayim beBeis Hashem." He's standing beBeis Hashem where lifnei hachotzer hachadosha, in front of the new courtyard. My chotzer hachadosha. What does this mean? New courtyard. This is actually the area of the Ezras Noshim that they added to the Azara, but it doesn't have the same halacha like the Azara itself. Amar Rabbi Yechanan, it's called chadasha shechitshu ba dvarim because they added new halachas here. And for Amru, and they said, Tvul Yoim al Yukonis lamachna leviyah, that a Tvul Yoim should not enter into the harabayis, which is called machna leviyah. There are the three categories. There's the machna shchina, which is the Azara and the Beis HaMikdash. Then there's the harabayis, which includes the Ezras Nashim as well, that a Tvul Yoim may not enter there. And then there's Yerushalayim, which is called machna Yisrael. So the guys are that he's not allowed to enter there. Okay, so now what's the question? Going back to the Braisa. If what Ola said in the name of Rish Lakish is true, that that if you enter partially, that's like you entered fully. So how is he able to, this individual that's a Mitzayra and the Tvul Yoim, how is he able to stick his fingers inside the Azara to be Mitayrim as a Mitzayra? The carbon Pesach is an essa which is kares if you don't bring it, but also walking into the azara when one is tamei is also a issa kares. Walking into the Ezras Noshim, into the harabayis when one is tamei is a lav, according to the Tana of this Braisa. But walking into the azara, or according to Ola, even just putting your fingers inside, is also a chi of kares. So then how is he able to stick his fingers inside to be mitayed himself to bring the carbon Pesach? So he answered, Ola answers, Ravashia, mitu nach, from this load that you're trying to put upon me, meaning you're asking on me, I can see the answer. Because Shani Mitzayre, the case of this Tvul Yaim, which according to the Tana of this Braise is a Chi of Kodesh for him to enter, but since he's also a Mitzayre, that's different. Because Hoyel v'hotel itzerasai, since he's a Mitzayre, and for the Mitzayre, which is Tameh, he's not allowed to enter, but over there, there's Exeris HaKasav, over there the Pasuk says that he may enter partially, he may stick his fingers inside, that's the only way to be Mitayre him, and the Torah says, you Mitayre him by him sticking his fingers inside. So by the Mitzayre, and that's also a Tvul Yaim, once the Torah allows him to stick his fingers inside as a Mitzayre, so then I say that heta applies to any other tumah that's on him as well. Even the tumah of him being a Tvul Yaim will also be allowed for him to stick his fingers inside. So in a regular case, Bia b'miktsas is not allowed, but in this case, the Torah allows it for the Mitzayre, so for the others, for the other tumah, it's also allowed. Yeah, okay, so that's the answer to this question. So now the Gemara brings a comparison to another case where you find this kind of a concept, that once the Torah is mater, for one kind of a tumah, for one thing, it's already a heter that he's allowed to stick in his fingers even though he's a Tvul Yaim. So Rav Yosef says, Kasavar Ola. According to Ola, he would hold that regarding a carbon Pesach, so here the halacha regarding a carbon Pesach is that if most of Klal Yisrael is Tameh, they can bring the carbon Pesach even while they're Tomei. Tomei Hotra B'tzibur or Hotra B'tzibur. Okay, well, what depends what kind of Tumah that is though. That's only from Tumas Mace, from a dead body. But a Tumah of a Zav, which comes from the body itself, that's a kind of Tumah. If most of Klal Yisrael is Tumah Zav, it will not push off the Tumah, and you cannot bring the carbon Pesach. But Narav Yosef says that according to Ula, Ruban Zavim, if first most of Klal Yisrael was Tameh, with what kind of Tumah? Of a Zav that usually would not push off. We would not push off this Tumah of Zav to bring the carbon Pesach. But then V'naso Tmei Meisim, then they also became most of them. Tmei Meisim, so now because they're additionally Tmei Meisim, once we say that the Torah is mater, the Tumas Meis, when most of Klal Yisrael is Tameh, they can bring the carbon Pesach, Hutru Lizivasan. We push off also for the Ziva, the other Tumah of Ziva, which is usually not pushed off, and they can bring the carbon Pesach. That's the halacha Rav Yosef said, comparing to the case we said before. But Abaye asks Rav Yosef, how could you compare this? Midami, it's not the same thing. Tumeh ishtaroi. By the Tumeh of the Mitzayre that could stick his fingers into that Zara to be Mitayed himself there, it's completely allowed. So therefore, I say that he could also stick his fingers inside even though he's a Tvul Yom. But Ziva lo yishtaroi, but the Ziva over here in this case, they were all Tumah Zav first. And that Tumah Zav that was there first, it never becomes allowed. So if they become Tumah Meis second, why should I say that the Tumas Meis that comes second should not be Metame the Tumas Ziva that they had first? In this case, this person was first the Mitzayre, and the Torah obligates him to stick his fingers inside to become Tahir, and then afterwards he became also a Tvul Yom. So over there, you're going to say that once he has the Heter as a Mitzayre first to stick his fingers inside, he's allowed to stick his fingers inside, even though he's also a Tvul Yom. But not in this case though, where they were all Tumas Zav first. So the Gemara amends this case and says, you're right. Amalei Dilma Hachikamar. Maybe this is what he was saying. Sorry, Abai that it says to Rav Yosef. Maybe Dilma Hachikamar. Maybe this is what the master was saying. Ruban Tmei Meisim. If most of Klal Yisrael was first Tmei Meisim, and then when they're Tmei Meisim, they're allowed to bring the carbon Pesach, and then only afterwards when Asu Zavim, then they become Zavim that they can't bring it. Since they already have a heter first for the Tmei Meisim, that heter applies also to the Ziva that came afterwards. That's similar to what we're saying here.
Tumah of a Mitzvah is not stronger than the Tumah of the Zavar?
It is, but we're talking over here about the carbon Pesach. By the carbon Pesach, if they were first Tmei Meisim, and then afterwards Tumah Ziva, so the Gemara is saying, just like we're saying regarding a Mitzayre, that we allow the Mitzayre not to bring the carbon Pesach. Mitzayre cannot bring the carbon Pesach, that's not what we're saying. But a Mitzayre, we said before, is allowed to stick his fingers inside the Azareh, even though he additionally became Tameh with a Tvul Yaim, but once he's allowed to stick in his fingers for the Mitzayre that was first, he's allowed to stick it in even though it's Tvul Yaim. Same thing over here, even though they are now also Tumah Ziva, second Tumah, which would not be Mutter, but because they were first Tumah Tmei Meisim, it would be allowed. That's the comparison that Ula is saying, that Rav Yosef is saying to what Ula said. So Amalei Rav Yosef said, yes, this is actually what I meant in this comparison. But Abaye argues it's still not the same thing. Amalei, the Bachya says, Abaye argued back and said, V'takati loy domi. You can't compare to the case of the Mitzayre. Because Mitzayre heterehu. By the case of Mitzayre that sticks his fingers inside, that's something that's completely allowed. The Torah is saying this is how he is Mitayed himself. So it's totally allowed. So there I could say the Svara, Hoyel ve'ishtiri, since it's completely allowed, ishtiri. So then he becomes allowed to do this, even if now he's additionally Tvul Yom. However, Tomeh, when it comes to the Reiv of Klal Yisrael, that's Tomeh, that they're allowed to bring the carbon Pesach. This is not something which is completely allowed. This is something that we push off the Tumah in order to allow him to bring the carbon. But it's the Tumah is there. It's something that is just pushed off. So laha itchi. And laha la itchi. Because it's not something that's completely a heter, but it's just that it overrides the obligation of bringing the carbon Pesach, pushes off the Tumah. So therefore that's something which is a chiddush. And that applies only to the Tumah of Tmei Meis and not to the additional Tumah of Zav. So you can't compare these two things. That's Abaye's svara. But Rava takes this very same svara and he says, no, that logically it goes the other way around. Adarabbe, on the contrary, ipche mistavre. The logic says the opposite. Mitzayre heteru. By the mitzayre that's sticking his fingers inside, there is nothing to push off. That's the way the Torah says you are matari yourself as a mitzayre. So that's completely allowed. So therefore over there, it's logical to say, loha ishteroi. So for the mitzayre to stick his fingers inside, that's allowed. That's what the Torah says has to be done. But loha lo ishteroi. But then if he's additionally tful yaim, tamei, so over here there's no reason to allow him as a tful yaim to stick his fingers inside. You don't see that the Torah is overriding anything. There's nothing overriding. For the mitzayre, this is how it's done. But not, it shouldn't apply if he's also a tful yaim. However, Tome the Choyehi, who that is, but when it comes to the Tome of a Tmei Meis, to bring a carbon Pesach, when most of Klal Yisrael is Tome, this is actually something where the Torah is saying, showing you the importance of carbon Pesach, that it overrides, that it's Doiche. So if so, Mali Chadechuye, Mali Shtei. So over here, this Svara actually does apply, that once you're pushing off one thing, so it could push off another thing as well. It shows you that the Torah is giving you the koyach to push off, so it pushes off already the tumah of Zavim as well. Okay, so so therefore Rabbi says the Svara is the opposite. The Gemara just concludes regarding this. Klal, I could see over here from this discussion between Abaye and Rava, the Tarvayas Viraluhu, both Abaye and Rava hold that Tumah the Choye B'tzibor, that when it comes to the Tumah for Korban Pesach, that when most of Klal Yisrael is Tumah they can bring, it's the Choya. It's pushed off. Rashi uses the term Bekoishi, that it's with hardship, that it overrides and it's pushed off. It's not Hutra, it's not something which is completely mutter. Which means that even in a case where you're pushing off the Tumah, and let's say Roiv of Kayanim are Tameh, and you're pushing off, they're allowed to be makar the Korban Pesach, but l'chatchil you should still try to find a kain that's tahir to bring it, because it's only pushing it off, b'koishi, with difficulty, and you need it sits. Rashi says you need it sits to be meratza for this. But there's another opinion that the tumah is hutra, it's totally allowed, there's no issue whatsoever. But from the discussion here we see that both Abaye and Rava held that it's only hutra, it's only pushed off.